Introduction to In the Days of These Kings, the Book of Daniel and Preterist Perspective by J. Rogers. I'm going to take a few minutes and go through the table of contents in the first section. You can order this book either through theforerunner.com right here, or you can go to lulu.com. I have a author's page that you can order books through, and that's probably the best place to go because there's all kinds of discounts. You can often get free shipping, and the markup is not as much on Lulu as it is at the Forerunner, so you'll get a better deal there. Here's the copyright information page, and here's my table of contents. The preface of In the Days of These Kings I'll be covering in the next podcast that we do. But what I do throughout the book is I introduce it with a preface. The introduction discusses the term preterism, and then I explain what my method is for interpreting the book of Daniel. First of all, I try to refute futurism, which is the popular eschatology of today. Then we talk about the structure, composition, and authorship of Daniel. Daniel is composed in a series of chiasms. I will be going over that. It was composed by Daniel in the 6th century BC. And there's a lot of objections to the early date of the 6th century BC by liberals, but those are fairly easy to answer from a conservative perspective. The idea that Daniel was a prophecy that was fulfilled after the fact is called vaticinium ex eventu. That means literally prophecy after the event. And from the very early centuries, there have been pagans, skeptics, and now liberals who believe that the book of Daniel was a prophecy that was written after the time of Maccabees in about 167 BC. And that what the author did was they took Daniel as a historical character, and then they showed how history was fulfilled through this prophecy. But there's pretty good evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls that was not the case. You can also see that by comparing the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek texts of Daniel that it was early. There's also evidence from some pre-Maccabean writings that quote from Daniel, such as the Book of Baruch and some other works, that Daniel was actually written in the century which it purports to be written in, which is the 6th century BC. Then finally, we have the testimony of Jesus Christ, who believed that Daniel was authentic. So if you're a Christian, if you're a conservative Christian that believes in the saving work of Jesus Christ, that Jesus was the Son of God, that the Bible is inerrant, you cannot believe that Daniel was written later, because Jesus himself believed that there were prophecies that were yet to be fulfilled in the book of Daniel. Then I discuss 4 millennial views and my 4 methods of interpretation. 4 millennial views are postmillennialism, amillennialism, premillennialism, and then dispensationalism. And the 4 methods of interpretation are the preterist view, which is Daniel's been fulfilled; the idealist view, which is that Daniel is fulfilled symbolically but not by specific events. Then there is the historicist view, which is Daniel is fulfilled throughout history. Then the futurist view, which is that some of the most important parts of Daniel are yet to be fulfilled. And then I discuss the superiority of the preterist method. So that pretty much sets up the entire book. A lot of people are going to be interested in just going directly to page 45, because this is where I give my very brief overview in about, as you can see here, it's less than 40 pages. Maybe it's about 35 pages or so in which I interpret the book of Daniel. This is like the quick and dirty version of my interpretation. And I only cover the prophetic portions of Daniel. I don't go into the historical parts that much. Part 2 is notes on Daniel. And the way that part 2 came about was that I first posted these articles as a series on a discussion group back in the early 2000s. And I got a lot of objections, mainly from a group of historicists. And so we talked about first, what is the definition of a preterist? I am a partial preterist, not a hyper-preterist, and I explain that in the book in detail. is historicism or preterism superior? What I found was that in refuting historicism, many of the same arguments can be used against futurism as well. Then we have a discussion of hermeneutics, which goes back to this section here again. The four methods of interpretation, which are preterism, historicism, futurism, and then idealism. Interestingly, Calvin, who's often thought to be a historicist, was actually a preterist, and Calvin never wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, so we don't know for sure how he would have interpreted that. And his view of Matthew 24 was also preterist. So to say that Calvin was preterist is accurate. I have a little discussion here on Calvin's commentary on Daniel. And then the big questions about eschatology that people always ask from the preterist point of view. Who is the little horn in Daniel? Who's the beast of Revelation? Who's the whore of Babylon in Revelation? Who's the Antichrist in 1st and 2nd John? And then who is the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2? Then I got into a lot of the discussions that we had online about the different chapters. People are basically in agreement on Daniel with most of the prophecies, like all people, the historicists, the preterists, the futurists, are basically in agreement that there were four kingdoms, that these kingdoms were Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And there are some, then people go off on certain things. Like there are certain things about Daniel that everyone agrees on, and then there are certain things that people disagree on. One of them is, what is the fourth kingdom? Is it Rome, or does that also include part of the Greek kingdom, which would be the Seleucid and Ptolemaic periods? Then we have the question of who are the 10 kings. That's very controversial, even among preterists. Who is the little horn? Again, there's disagreement on that. Some people say it's Nero. Some people say it's all the Roman emperors. Some people say it's Vespasian or Titus. I hold the view that it's Nero in the book. And then I describe the reason I hold this view is because the beasts and the horns are fluid symbols throughout the book of Daniel, and also throughout all of prophecy. Beasts can be an individual, but they can also be a kingdom. The same thing with a horn. The horn can be a king, but it can also be a kingdom as well. There's a section on Daniel 8, Calvin on the little horn. Calvin says that the little horn is actually Antiochus Epiphanes. That's a very common view. What are the 77s as the other controversial part? Everyone agrees that 77s means 490 years, but when did the 490 years begin? Is there a break between the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks? And is there a break in the 70th week? These are all questions that people disagree on, and I give my view. Does the fourth vision of Daniel extend past the 77s, or does it end in the middle of the 70th week, which is the view I hold? When is the abomination of Daniel 11:31? I say that Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 deal specifically with Antiochus Epiphanes, and then the abomination of desolation in Daniel 9 and Daniel 12 deal specifically with the destruction of the temple in AD 7. Who's the man of sin is another question that I constantly get. I discuss that. My view is a little bit different than other preterists here. I don't think that the man of sin was Nero. I think that 2 Thessalonians 2 is more along the lines of Revelation 20 and 1 John, where he speaks of the Antichrist. How do we interpret Revelation in light of Daniel? What I found in researching Revelation from a preterist perspective was that Revelation is often interpreted in a vacuum. People don't spend enough time on the Old Testament first. What they do is they jump right into Revelation, and they use a this means that kind of a method of interpreting Revelation rather than letting Scripture interpret Scripture. So I spent about, I would say, 20 years on and off studying Daniel, and then my ultimate goal is going to be to take Daniel and other books of Old Testament prophecy, which I deal with down here in this section, and then use that to interpret Revelation. How do you compare Revelation 17 with Daniel 7, for instance? I have a little section on that. It goes on for about 4 pages. And then there's some discussion. This is a question that I often get. The first Roman king, if we say that the 10 kings of Daniel chapter 7 are the 10 emperors. A lot of people will say that, well, Julius Caesar was not the first emperor, Augustus was. But actually, that's an anachronism. That's a modern view. People in the first century certainly said that Julius Caesar was the first emperor, and I prove that. Josephus says that, as well as Suetonius. And we have other references as well. Part 3 of the book is by far the longest. And when I first wrote this book, I thought that it would just look like this. I thought that I would have a short introduction, my original articles, which were the prophecy explained, and then notes on Daniel. And then I would kind of like write 100 more pages, maybe 70 to 100 more pages on the historical background. Specifically, who are these guys down here? Who are the kings? But you can see I got carried away. And it took me about 18 months to round out the book. And what I found in writing it was that the more I dug into Daniel, the more I realized I didn't know. And the more I learned, the more fascinated I became. So this is really a great book. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to come back to part 3 in my next video.